Hello Year 10, this is the next lesson in the sequence on the Second World War, chapter 4 of the Living in Nazi Germany course, and I promised that I would change shirt, and I have. Alas, I am still at home with purple wallpaper and the same poster. I did have more, as you know, but I took them back into work and then I forgot them. So that was clever. Nevertheless, it still works, it still fits. This particular quote still works very well with Nazi Germany, and especially the Second World War, where we as British people seem to have an awful lot riding on it, and we have an awful lot of beliefs about the Second World War, most of which aren't actually true. Nevertheless, we're looking at the Germans' experience of the Second World War under the Nazis, and I left it last time with my bad pirate impression and an attempt to bring German into piracy, which was never really a good idea. And we were talking about the first phase of the war. Now, if you remember, the first phase of the war was when the Nazis were outclassing the rest of the world militarily. Everything was going reasonably well when it came to the battlefield. So I'm going to pick up the story today, and in case you haven't guessed, this is the second phase of the war where things don't go as well, which kind of given away by the map at the beginning, I think. So here we go. We finished off with booty. Yar, me hearties, a bit of booty. Nazi Germany going on a booty call through Europe for gold, art and perfume. We're now moving on to the second phase of the war between 1942 and 1945. Now note those dates. 1942 is a turning point, even though there's no major battle. There's nothing in particular that occurs. The Battle of Stalingrad is ongoing, but it won't be won until 1943 by the Soviets. So it's weird to talk about 1942 as a turning point from the point of view of people at the time. They didn't see it this way. We can, looking back. It makes much more sense to us. So if you get a source from 1942, bear in mind the authors will not realise it is a turning point. We know it is, they don't. And this is where the war goes more badly and where civilians therefore are more unhappy. And you might recognise this image from the beginning when I was talking about the background images. And this is a film still from Downfall. Well worth seeing the film, by the way, though I have a sneaking suspicion it's a 15, so be careful with that one. And it's Otto Bruns playing, Otto Gans, I said Bruns last time as well, it's Gans, playing Hitler. And he does a remarkably good job of reenacting the last known film of Hitler, which is him outside the Führer bunker, giving out medals to, I think, 12-year-olds for knocking out Soviet tanks in the Battle of Berlin. And if there isn't a more stark and dystopic vision of life in the under the Nazis in Germany, yeah, it's the most dystopic vision. What causes this? Well, Germany is simply outproduced by the Allied nations. We make more, I say we weren't there. The USA, the Soviet Union, France and Britain simply make more stuff. Here's a fairly obvious bar chart to show that. So if you want to nick these figures and stick them in your notes, it's a really good idea. I think on the version of this that you have, there might be sources attached. If not, there will be on the version I've attached today. This is a chart showing the arms production, and it's got tanks over here. The Nazis are producing around about 8,000 tanks. In 1942, the Soviet Union produces 22,000. Nazis produce around about 16,000 aircraft. The Soviet Union produced 23,000. The Nazi Germany, Third Reich, produces around about 11,000 artillery pieces. They're the big guns that fire those shells I showed off last lesson. And the Soviet Union produces 123,000 of them. You get a feeling, therefore, that this is just one of the Allies, just one of the fronts the Nazis are fighting on. This isn't even the USA. It's not Britain. This is just one enemy, the Soviet Union. And they are vastly outproducing the Nazis. Now, it's said that Nazi tanks are very high quality and that there were 3 enemy tanks. At the Battle of Kursk, that's unfortunate because they're outnumbered 4-1 and therefore the Soviets kind of destroy them. Other ways of looking at this, if I take away my face, is at the amount of stuff that you produce in GDP. This is the amount of the worth of goods. And it's measured in 1990 prices, billions of US dollars. I don't know. The point here is comparing the amount. Now, the interesting bit is this bit at the bottom. If you take the Allied totals of the amount of stuff they produced in money and you divide it by the Axis totals, then you end up with this number. If that number is above 1, so 1 would be equal production. If it's above 1, say 2, then the Allies produce twice as much. If it's below 1, the Axis are producing more. That's how it works. Now, who the Axis are changes over time. France switches between the sides because it's conquered, and Italy switches right at the very end. But you can see, if you just look at these numbers, you don't need to know the rest of these numbers, don't worry about the columns. Before the war begins, those that will become the Allies and those that are already the Axis, the Allies are outproducing the Axis by nearly 2.5 times as much. The Axis make good in a year, I suppose, to 2.3 times. Then in 1940 to 2.1. At the height of their power, they're being outproduced twice as much by the Allies. By 1942, it's twice and a bit more, then 2.3, then 3.1, then 5 times as much in 1945. In other words, it's fairly obvious from our perspective, the Nazis could never, ever win. Now you look at the map, and the map I showed you at the beginning of last lesson, and it's very difficult to wrap your head around that. It looks like Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, is absolutely wiping the floor with the Allies. But you look at this, and it becomes very, very clear that the Nazis didn't stand a chance. From 1943 onwards, there's the impact of constant bombing raids as well. Hang on, it's not working. Allow me to pause one moment. Sorry about that. I'll try again. From 1943 onwards, that's more like it. There is the impact of constant bombing raids on Germany. This is a photograph, and you can't quite see it because I've not got the white background, and I apologise. It's February 1945, the bombing of Dresden, where where the RAF made a firestorm. This is what was left of the centre of Dresden. It's a major industrial city in Germany. And you kind of see there that photograph of the destruction, how difficult it would have been for anybody in Germany to go to work. The impact of the constant bombing raids is going to be to utterly destroy the morale of the German people. How can they possibly live like this? Up until this point, you could argue that the German people were enjoying the war. It was going reasonably well. From 1943 onwards, constant Allied bombing raids will absolutely mess with ordinary Germans and their understanding of the war. The propaganda, I'll come on to it. The constant propaganda that they're being told is that the war is going well, and they look out of their windows and they see stuff like this, and they think, if this is the war going well, what on earth is the war going badly? Then you've got the actual cost of the war in human lives. Here I've got a chart, and down the left I've got the years, and across the top you've got where German soldiers are dying. And these are solely German soldiers, those fighting for the Third Reich, those fighting for the Nazis. In 1940, the West is France, the Low Countries, I guess Britain as well, because we are invaded in Britain. There is an invasion in the Channel Islands. It goes reasonably well, and they do collaborate with the Nazis. And the Nazis lose 61,000 soldiers in that battle. Others are things like, I guess, Yugoslavia, Greece, the Mediterranean, Norway, Denmark. The Nazis lose around about 41,000 soldiers. That's a lot. That's 100,000 men in a year. In 1941, they invade Russia. They invade the Soviet Union, and they lose 302,495 on that front alone. In the West, the whole of the West, they lose 11,000 soldiers. In other areas, so including Africa, for example, they lose 43,000. In 1942, they lose 506,815 troops in the Soviet Union, 12,000 in the West, facing Britain, and 48,000 everywhere else. In 1943, when the bombing raids begin, they lose 700,653 soldiers in the Soviet Union, 11,000 in the West, 78,000 in others. In 1944, with the Soviet steamroller fully engaged, they lose 1.2 million men in the Soviet Union, compared to 244,000, this is during the D-Day landings, and 278,000 elsewhere. In 1945, other fronts account for 57,000 troops, that's Italy, and Germany itself, they lose 1.2 million men defending Germany, mainly against the Soviets. If you didn't believe me earlier when I said the Soviets won the Second World War in Europe, This kind of gives the game away. And then you look at the totals at the bottom, and they are phenomenal. There's 2.7 million troops lost in the Soviet Union alone, a further 1.2 million facing them in Germany, 339,000 fighting the Allies, that you or I would understand. That's the US and Britain and France, and other fronts account for 500,000 men. It's fairly obvious that the Nazis can't keep this going. That is an incredible amount of soldiers being lost. Who can replace that? No matter what your population is, that is incredibly large. So what happens to the people at home? Because we're not talking about soldiers, we're talking about ordinary people. They end up working harder, and this is the weird thing. As the bombing rates increase, as the situation grows more desperate, Germany actually starts a wartime economy, and Germany begins to produce more, not less, stuff. That's right. With that photograph of Dresden, more people decide that there's little to be gained from surrender or trying to throw themselves on the mercy of the Allies, because the Allies have no mercy. And therefore they work harder because they know that there's no other way out. Either they win, like the Nazis tell them they can, or they die. And so they work harder. So life becomes working hard, there's less food, the rations go down, and you've got to put up with, nearly 5 million soldiers dying. And that means that literally everybody in Germany loses somebody they know. And keep in mind, there's 3.5 million more civilians to pile onto that total. The population of Germany is only around about 65 million. So we're talking around about just shy of 10 million people dying in Germany. That's a lot. That's a sixth. Every sixth person dies. And then there are the sacrifices. In 1941-42, they have to give up fur coats, their winter clothing, because the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't supposed to last until the winter. They invaded in June. They were expecting a victory by the end of the year. Therefore, the Wehrmacht and the SS never invested in winter gear. It's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union do so well. It's not because their soldiers are used to the cold or anything like that. That's a bit racist, by the way. It's mainly because they actually prepare for a winter war. So their troops actually have winter kit. Yes, I know, the Soviet Union actually have kit. Surprising, not the picture that's usually painted. They don't have weapons, but they got kit. The Wehrmacht, etc., they've got weapons, but they don't have the kit. So people back home donate fur coats, and that means soldiers are going into battle in fur coats. It's ridiculous and weird. Then you've got evacuees. As places get invaded by the Soviet Union, because remember, this is a war of survival. This is a war, a titanic struggle of civilizations. This is a war of extermination. This is where the Nazis push into the east and murder everybody they find and replace them with German farmers. Well, those German farmers live there for a couple of years, I guess, and then they have to run away when the Soviets come, and they're angry because they find the mass graves and they find the evidence of the exterminations, and they take it out on the people they find, who may or may not be guilty, but at least they're there. And so, yeah, they kind of run away. They've got to be put up somewhere, and Germany isn't really prepared for an influx of evacuees on that scale, so it becomes cramped. It becomes sacrificial, and clothing becomes virtually non-existent. You've got the stuff you've got, sure, but if it gets broken or it becomes damaged or it becomes unusable, then tough. You make do, you mend. People in Britain thought they had it bad. Germany's got literally nothing producing uniforms anymore because they can't get the textiles. They're using human hair to run tanks and to insulate the U-boats towards the end of the war. Human hair. All right, maybe that's taken from the Jews in the concentration camps. I'm not sure that actually makes it any better. I think it makes it worse. But the reason they're doing that is because they've run out of other textiles. And the refugees increase as USSR invades. Rumors abound about what USSR Soviet troops are going to do to German civilians. And trust me, it's pretty bad and it's pretty brutal. Forgive me, this is a video that's probably going to be seen by parents, and I apologize, but I encourage them to watch too. We are talking monumental end-of-world stuff. We're talking about soldiers that have been brutalized on the front lines. No quarter is asked for, no quarter is given, where both sides willingly and almost gladly murder the other side. And we're talking about Soviet soldiers who believe they are the good guys. Now, keep that in mind. As they invade Germany, resistance grows more and more desperate. More than that, the Soviets have marched through miles upon miles upon miles of Soviet countryside and have seen the mass graves. They've seen the destruction of their livelihoods and their villages and their countrymen. They are angry and they want revenge and they carry out reprisals. So awful is their reputation that one village on the Danube, I've used another name. It's in the oblast that was kept by the Soviets at the end of the war. The German population of this village, on hearing that the Soviets are on their way, load their coats with stones and their children's coats with stones, join hands and walk into the swollen river Oder to drown themselves rather than face the Soviets. That's how bad it gets. They can't get out in time. And yet, in amongst all of this, Albert Speer, remember that fella, the architect, the guy in propaganda, the guy that people usually write about in the exams, go, Albert Speer's not very important, he's just an architect. He is like the second in command of the Third Reich toward the end. Albert Speer is given the job of creating a war economy. Yes, that's right. The Nazis didn't think about it until about 1944, and they achieve it. Here is the big change to the economy. So this is percentage of income spent on military projects and civil projects. You'll remember I said before the war began, they were spending 40% of their income on military projects. That actually goes down when the war begins. When the war begins, they're spending 38% of their income on military projects and 20% of their income on projects for, I don't know, housing and roads, repairs, wages, that kind of thing. We call it civil expenditure. In 1940-41, the following year, they spend 55.9% of their income on military projects and 24.1% on civilian projects. 1941-42, 73.3% is spent on military projects and 28.2% is spent on civil projects. And you're beginning to realize the maths don't add up. They go above 100%. The Nazis start spending money that simply doesn't exist. They're making it up. They can only achieve this if they continue to steal stuff, to pillage, and to liberate booty from the countries that they own. In 1942-43, they spent 86.2% of their income on the military and 37.8% on civil projects. 43-44, and it's 99.4% of their income on military projects and 30% of their income on civil projects. Yes, that is impossible, and yet they do it. And people accept that. The next time someone tells you that money is worth something, remember this moment. Maybe it isn't. The production obviously is concentrated on the military. You can see that on the chart on the left there. So you know that. You don't need me to tell you that. Postal service is closed. There just aren't the people to run it. You can't send letters. Now, there have been studies undertaken. Not receiving mail really makes you feel isolated. You have been involved in a lockdown, and yet you have had the opportunity to talk to people electronically and over a phone and via the mail. Consider how lonely and isolated you have felt. Now factor that in with no electronics, no telephone communications, no mail system, and you begin to understand how isolated people feel, and that has a tremendous effect in a way that you can understand and previous generations of students that I've taught can't. There's little entertainment. There are no cinemas, a bit like now, because they're closed due to the bombing. It's just too dangerous. You can't have that many workers killed in a single area. You kind of need them to run the factories. So they close everywhere where they might congregate. Military output does increase. The Nazis produce more tanks at the end of the war than they produced at the beginning. And one of the weirdest things is they produce, I think in the Oberammergau in Austria, there's an entire factory complex built into a mountain. The Allies don't discover it until after the war is over. And in that factory complex, they find over 3,000 jet aircraft. 3,000 jet aircraft. The only thing that stopped them going into battle was there weren't the pilots to fly them. But they never knew it was there. They never bombed the Oberammergau. They didn't know it existed. The output increases. Still not enough. It's just, you can't do enough. The impact on women, we talked about it with women earlier in the course, but just drive that point home. They're torn between roles. What do they do to defend their fatherland? Do they raise children to be soldiers? Some do. In the Battle of Berlin, for example, a 5-year-old is found by the Soviets taking pot shots. And the Soviets don't know what to do. Sooner or later, this 5-year-old with a rifle is going to kill someone by accident, if nothing else. So they're the good guys. How do they deal with a child who's putting people's lives at risk? Well, they spank him and send him on his way, having taken his rifle away. Sooner or later, actually a day later, the same unit is still fighting through Berlin. And once again, there's a sniper. They investigate. They find the same 5-year-old. He's found another rifle. He's doing it again. What do? They can't take him prisoner. There's nowhere to put him. And every time they release him, he shoots at them. So they shoot him. And they are the good guys. Do you understand the kind of mental break that must cause? The kind of strain that must put those soldiers under? They firmly believe they are fighting on the right side of history, and they've just executed a 5-year-old. In conclusion, the war is awful. It becomes increasingly militaristic. Remember, a love of one's army. Everything for the army. There is increasing hardship. Ever since that first phase went so well, things get worse and worse and worse. And I don't think we've even scratched the surface of how bad it gets. I will give you more examples when I start talking about the final months of the war, but I'll leave you with this awful story, an anecdote. After the war is over, Berlin is split into 4 zones. 3 of them are on the west side. They are the US, the French, and the British zone. The other zone is the Soviet zone. Now remember, it was the Soviets that captured Berlin. It was the Soviets that fought the Battle of Berlin. When the British soldiers arrived in their sector, they were astonished that whenever they drove around in large groups, German women would see them and instantly start stripping off their clothes. It gave rise to the idea that German women were, and forgive me, easy. Why do you think that was? The answer, I'm afraid to say, is gang rape on an industrial scale. There are stories of people being raped to death by Soviet troops. I just told you the Soviets felt they were on the right side of history. How could they possibly believe that when that is their behavior? Well, it's simple. They found evidence that the German troops retreating were doing it to Soviet civilians as they left. And they were. In some cases, SS troops were raping people with bayonets. So the Soviets want revenge. And they carry it out. With that anecdote in mind, perhaps this last point is unsurprising. Hitler is less popular in the second phase of the war. Now, when it comes to answering questions about this in an exam situation, you will of course be expected to answer in the academic voice, the passive voice. The awful situations that I have described to you, you will use as examples and no more. We're not going to get tied up on the morality of it. I think that's fairly clear and obvious. Rather, you are going to illustrate the 2 phases of the war and how they change life under the Nazis. And I have a task for you to finish off this particular lesson. So it's not all me talking. This task here revolves around this sheet. Now, I think the version that you've got isn't terribly clear. I think when I've saved this, you'll have a more clear version. The one I saved last week for you has this slide, but I don't think it's got one you can actually fill in. If you can't print stuff off, don't worry. Just divide an A4 sheet or an A3 sheet, whatever you've got available really, into 6. Because what you're going to do is you're going to try and summarize the notes you have taken in a visual format. Now, don't worry about this. You've already written down the notes, but I know, and I think you have an inclination now, that the more visual notes are, the more easy they are, the easier they are to remember. So, can you split the war into 6 different things, 6 different aspects, chronologically, like a timeline? And I'd like you to create kind of like a comic strip or a storyboard if you prefer. The way to do this, by the way, is to split the bottom bit here into a very short description. Don't be tempted to write it all out. You've already done that once. You've got that in your notes. You don't have to write out huge amounts. And then try to depict it visually in these boxes. How does it change over time? So you might start with the initial declaration of war, the initial drop in popularity. Maybe you've got Hitler stood here with a Nazi salute saying, we're going to invade everybody. And then you've got the people grumbling, oh no, there's less food. And some children going, oh, but we've got loads. I don't know. And then aircraft and tanks, I don't know, the war starts. Then you've got here where things go well. You've got German troops outclassing the Allies. Maybe there's a tank knocking down a bank and a German troop going, I've got gold! And then a sort of lightning strike here. And then you've got the people back home going, oh, thank you for bringing back perfume. And then you've got this bit here where you've got a map of Europe with the Nazis ascendant. I don't know, like the map at the beginning. And you can say that the Nazis are on top of the world. And you've got happy looking civilians. The Nazis are looking happy. Hitler even has a smile on his face. Remember Pringle Hitler? I remember Pringle Hitler. Then down here, you've got the Battle of Stalingrad and how it ends in defeat. You can look that up if you want more information, but it ends in defeat in 1943. So I don't know, Nazi tanks with smoke billowing out of them and a couple of Soviet troops. Remember the flag in my room? It's the red one with the hammer and sickle in the corner, looking happy. And then you've got this bit here where things get bad and you've got the sacrifices. There's no cinema, there's bombing going on. German workers looking glum because there's nothing to do and they're getting shot at. Then you've got the end with maybe not the gang rape, but something equally terrible going on here. Maybe it's the 5-year-old shooting at Soviet soldiers and then getting spanked. I don't know. But you get an idea of just how bad it's gone. And I don't know, Pringle Hitler having shot himself. Please don't illustrate that with blood, but you get the idea. Things go awfully toward the end. And some way of summing up what you've talked about, the sacrifices, the deaths, the change in focus. Maybe in this one, you've got a factory in the background that's producing wartime production, so planes pouring out of it. It doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to look like an actual aeroplane factory, for goodness sake. I don't know what one of those looks like. Do you? It just has to be a representation that you understand to mean that. Use symbols, use diagrams. Don't draw it, true to life. It's not an art lesson. It's a history lesson. If you're good at art, ace. I did art too. I was appalling. I got a C. What's that equivalent? 4 or 5. I guess it's a pass. You guys, it's supposed to be symbolic. Just don't cover it with writing. Cover it with some labels so it makes sense. It's not just a random series of pictures. But try not to just write in the boxes. You've done that already. If you're dubious and you're thinking, sir, how dare you? I will never do such a thing. I will always ever write my notes. Fine, whatever. Draw this one. No matter how bad it is, you'll get a chance to see whether it works or not. I did the same with mind maps. I hate them to this day. I hated them when I was you, and I refused to make any. But my favourite history teacher asked us to do it, and as a sop to my favourite history teacher, I drew one. It is the only thing I could remember in the exam. Damn it. Doesn't mean I hate them any less, but it actually saved me and actually got me a B rather than a fail. Just saying. So no matter how much you hate drawing these things, have a go. The worst that happens, it doesn't help. The best that happens, you've found something that will be worthwhile later. So that's the lesson for today. Rather, the first lesson. I'm going to do 2. That's the first lesson. You've got a bit of lecture notes and you've got a task towards the end. As usual, comment. You can submit the comic strip if you wish. The key thing is there are 2 phases of the war. Phase 1, when it goes well. Phase 2, where it goes badly. That's the wrong way around for you guys, and I apologize. But you get the idea. And try and illustrate that somehow that makes sense with a couple of specific examples. You've got 1 per box. That means you've got 6 specific examples to throw at a page, and that's easily enough to carry an essay or to put sources in their context in an exam on a 15 marker. So keep that in mind. I hope it's been useful to you. Thank you if you have been for watching. Good luck with the image task. I look forward to it. We've got one more lesson on this, and it'll be coming up after this one. So when you're ready, you can go and watch that. Have a lovely day, Year 10, and I may or may not see you around. Oh, yeah, sorry.